Hi everybody. I'm Tiffany Fennell, Chair of the VA section or Veterans Affairs section of Division 18, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar titled The Beginning of VA Psychology and the VA Psychology Training Program from 1946 to 1966, presented by Dr. Rodney Baker. This webinar is sponsored by the VA section of APA's Division 18, Psychologists in Public Service. And as you know, Division 18 is the home division for VA psychologists in APA and also includes other public service psychologists like those in state and public hospitals, Indian country, criminal justice, and police and public safety. For more information about Division 18 and the VA section, please check out the notes and files pods for resource links and brochures. You'll also find a copy of today's slides in the files pod that you can download for reference. All questions can be entered into the chat box. There'll be time left towards the end to answer questions. And if there are any technical difficulties, as you can see, we sometimes experience them, please just let me know in the chat box and I'll attend to you as quickly as possible. So I have to say I was really thrilled when Dr. Baker, our VA psychology historian, agreed to present on the history of VA psychology for our webinar series. He's edited and co-edited several books and chapters on the subject. Additionally, Dr. Baker is a retired chief of psychology and mental health service line director from the South Texas Veterans Healthcare System in San Antonio. He's highly respected in Division 18. Not only is he a past president of the division, but in 2010 he received our division's highest honor, the Harold M. Hildreth Award for Distinguished Public Service. Dr. Baker is also the recipient of the 2017 American Psychological Foundation Gold Medal Award for Life Achievement in the Practice of Psychology. So this past year, Dr. Baker passed the torch of Division 18 historian to Dr. Timothy Carmody and historian for the Association of VA Psychologist Leaders to Dr. Kathleen McNamara. And so as we get started today, Dr. Baker is going to tell us a little bit more about the historian team and then get into our early years. I'll turn it over to you now, Dr. Baker.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. Well, as Tiffany announced, Kathy McNamara, recently retired from the Hawaii VA Medical Center system, has been selected as the new AVAPL historian, and taking that responsibility off of my shoulders. I might always add that I will always be a VA psychology historian. I'm just no longer the AVAPL historian. Now, we started something different this year with creating a historian team. Um, and Kathy and I kind of put our heads together. We felt that it was important to have somebody whose portfolio, if you will, was the VA psychology training program. And we selected Jody Rubenstein, and he has been approved by AVAPL as the co-historian. And those of you who know Jody, he's retired chief of psychology at Dallas. And the second portfolio, if you will, would be the VA Psychology Research Program. And we were very happy to choose and have him accept Terry Keene as the person who would be co-historian with special responsibilities for the VA psychology research. And as you mentioned, Tim Carmody has not only been selected my replacement for the Division 18 historian, but he's also on the historian team, and will kind of function as both a liaison from Division 18 and possibly work out some relationship with the VA section with AVAPL. So that just very briefly introduces you to the people, and if we have some time later, I am trying my best to have 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end of my presentation. And if there either questions on my presentation, um, or if you do have questions about the historian team, uh, please send me an email or Kathy an email. Tiffany can get you those emails if not. Okay, thanks for your introduction, Tiffany. Um, as Tiffany indicated, I'm going to take a look at the first 20 years of the VA psychology and its training program. Um, and I just had a couple of comments that I wanted to make before I began my formal presentation. Much of what I am going to talk about today was first covered in the book on the history of VA psychology that I co-authored with Wade Pickering for APA Books in 2007. And when we get to the end of my presentation, the last bibliography slide uh, has that reference as that citation as the first reference. And again, I'll just remind you, if you have not yet um, downloaded in the files area where it says the beginning of, you can't see all of it there, but it's a 589 kilobyte. That's where you can download this presentation in its PowerPoint form. Um, and as one of the objectives of the learning objectives of the webinar, I'm presenting that not only for you to follow along or to remind yourself what I said, uh, but it's also can be used to introduce the accomplishments of VA psychology to interns and postdoctoral residents during training orientation. And I do know a few stations that do include that in their orientation programs right now. Um, the last comment I'll make before I start my formal comments is that I will not be including material in this presentation on the rich history of early VA psychology research, but the 2007 book I just alluded to does include two chapters describing some early and critical research and planning resources by psychologists that directly affected patient care in the VA. One example is a cooperative research venture by psychologists examining psychosocial issues of the patient with pulmonary tuberculosis that resulted in a 1961 psychological monograph published by, excuse me, published by APA. The second comment on my presentation is that, of course, it is a history, and I invite you to consider the assessment of history and definition on your screen. History is all about what happened, and what happened is a story. Now, depending on your past exposure to history, you may have the same reaction that Charles Drebing had in reviewing a history book for APA Books. He said, History and Systems of Psychology was the least popular class among the required courses in my graduate program. The lectures and readings about past theorists, research, and events generated about as much excitement as paying tuition. And I have to admit that I shared some of Drebing's comments reflecting my own exposure to history education with demands to remember lists of events and names and dates. In this presentation, however, I'm going to expose you to the stories of what happened in the beginning of VA psychology and its training program, and I'm hoping you'll find that an interesting account. By the way, that quote by Drebing was the way he started his review of the book that I co-authored with Wade Pickering for APA Books on the History of Psychology, that I've alluded to a couple of times already now. However, Drebing, given that introduction, said that's only because he wasn't exactly fond of being asked to write a review by APA on a history book. He did write an excellent review, a very fair review, and it ended up with the comment, Baker and Pickering have written a well-crafted historical resource. Most important for me, as a VA psychologist, that's Drebing we're talking, I gained a valuable sense of how my work fits into and has benefited from the contributions of those who have gone before me. Surprisingly, this book is both relevant to my current work and provides insights into where that book might be heading in the future, where that work might be heading in the future. Although I'm not ready to go back and have my reread my history and systems text, I am ready to recommend this book to fellow psychologists and have already done so. Uh, I'm hoping that you'll have at least a similar or close to similar experience with this presentation about stories. Now, the first thing I wanted to do, however, is that I'm only going to cover the first 20 years of VA psychology, but I wanted to take a look at this graph that has an overview of the growth of VA psychology doctoral staff and training appointments over the last 72 years. Prior to 1946, there were virtually no doctoral trained psychology treatment staff in the VA, and master's level technicians provided assessment and limited vocational counseling by services. Now, doctoral VA psychology staff were first recruited in 1946 with the start of the VA psychology program, and that is tracked by the blue line on this graph. Even by the fall of 1946, however, when 215 psychology students were assigned to begin their training in the VA, and we'll be talking more about that later, there were less than 60 doctoral staff in the VA. Again, the blue line. And doctoral staff didn't equal or even exceed the number of psychology trainees until the 1960s. After 2000, however, take a look at that steep rise in that blue line. The growth of doctoral staff tripled in less than 20 years until over 5,500 doctoral staff were providing clinical and program services to veterans in VA medical centers in the last fiscal year. And the VA has easily retained its long-standing claim over the years to employing more clinical and counseling doctoral staff in the United States than any other single patient care organization. Just tracking the red line with the pre-doctoral or interns. You'll note from 1970 to 2000, it looked like there's a drop in the number of pre-doctoral students. Actually, the funding level was about the same, if not a little bit larger, as from over those years. The drop was primarily due to the shift from funding less expensive part-time psychology trainees to a primary focus on funding more expensive full-time internship training. Tracking the green line, that represents funded postdoctoral psychology students, which were first appointed in the VA in 1991. It reached 213 in 2010, and in the 2018 fiscal year, 454 postdoctoral students were funded by the VA. It can also be noted that the VA's funding of 1,225 interns and postdoctoral students in that fiscal year also exceeds that for any other single funding source of psychology training in the United States, including that of the National Institute of Mental Health and its grants. What I am going to do, however, is take a look at the forces after World War II that led to the reorganization of the VA, talk about the establishment of VA psychology and the training program to provide doctoral psychologists for the VA, and kind of complete by the 50s and 60s, by which time psychology had earned a reputation for leadership, and innovation in patient care. It will also be noted in this presentation that need for clinically trained doctoral psychologists was in fact met by the VA training program. So the beginning of VA psychology and the beginning of the VA psychology training program are virtually identical, intertwined stories. Although the VA was established in 1930, the VA that most of us recognize today got its start in 1946. That was when a massive restructuring and increase in patient care programs, services, and staffing was needed to take care of millions of new veterans returning from World War II who would be eligible for and expect health care in the VA. The VA had a number of problems in 1946, however. VA employees had enlisted, as did millions of other patriotic Americans. And during the war, the Army actually had to send military doctors to work in VA hospitals to take care of patients. And by 1945, three-fourths of the 2,300 physicians in the VA were on active military duty. And it was an accepted fact that most of these military doctors would be leaving the military and the VA, and there would be significant staffing problems in taking care of both the World War I and the new World War II patients needing care.
Dr.
At the
Baker,
start of 19,
excuse me, this is,
yes,
oh, sorry, Dr. Baker. We're having some issues where the slides are not advancing on their own as you're going through the presentation. You can continue
oh,
to speak, but I'm going to try re-uploading them and maybe then they'll advance correctly for people. Because
oh,
um,
okay, no,
anyway, so
that's fine. Yeah,
I
we are now
apologize.
on number note 7. Uh,
Okay.
that is entitled "Problems for the VA in 1946 Continued." Um, and I'm having
Okay.
a little bit difficulty in advancing slides myself, so why don't I just say next slide and indicate I'm trying to do that too. Make
Okay.
sense?
And I'm just going to upload
Okay.
them again too, and hopefully that'll solve it. But continue. Sorry, everyone. Continue on,
Okay.
Dr. Baker.
Okay. Well, when we get slide 7 back, it'll basically say what
Okay.
I started talking about the problems for the VA in 1946. Um, in addition to that staffing issue with the military, doctors having to staff the VA patient care, at the start of 1946, the VA had 81,000 authorized beds, but many were closed due to staffing shortages. And 69% of the operating beds were occupied with patients from World War I. And the majority of the World War I patients had a psychiatric diagnosis with an average length of stay of 500 days. Reducing that length of stay would surely be needed in order to provide bed care for the new World War II veterans. And that is 7, and no, I think that's 6. Let me see. Yeah, the next slide says continued. Okay, and okay, I think we've got it now. 7 problems with the VA, and um, we are now on the slide that says President Truman asked General Omar Bradley to serve as the VA administrator and fix its problems. General Bradley had been in charge of U.S. and Army and other forces in Europe and was a very popular general for officers and enlisted men alike. He was noted for listening to the issues of his troops and for never losing his temper. In one story told about Bradley, a difficult German prisoner of war was being interviewed, and one of Bradley's aides nervously fingered his rifle and accidentally sent a bullet whizzing by the general's ear. Now, Bradley was reported to have asked calmly, "Can't you be a little more careful with that darn thing, please?" Now, that story probably passed as quickly among privates and generals alike in the Army in Europe as a YouTube story might reach out to our population today. Truman knew that General Bradley would be trusted by veteran patients to take care of them, and Bradley accepted Truman's request and became the Veterans General. All right, in addition to Bradley's reputation for listening, he was also known for his organizational skills and for choosing good people to work with him. With no medical training himself, after being appointed the new VA administrator, he asked General Paul Hawley to join him. Now, Hawley had been a physician and in charge of all 16,000 physicians and responsible for all medical care for troops in the field in Europe. Bradley wanted Hawley to be in charge of medical care in the VA. Hawley's first decision, he had been an Army doctor his entire medical career, and he knew he would need acceptance by the AMN, the American Association of Medical College, especially for the key plan that he and Bradley had for improving VA medical care. That was to establish training affiliations between the VA and the nation's medical schools. Hawley, in turn, also chose Dr. Paul Magnuson to help him, a respected leader of medicine and medical education in the country. Now, Magnuson had also been an advocate for medical school affiliations for many years and had in the past tried to argue with previous administrators and Congress for such affiliations. So Hawley knew that Magnuson was the best person to argue that position with the nation's medical schools and turned that task over to him while he and Bradley focused on the legislation they believed necessary to improve veterans' care. Bradley and Hawley spent much of the late summer and fall of 1945 pulling together the legislative package to reorganize the VA to improve patient care. Now, the legislation had three major components. The first was to take the recruitment of doctors, dentists, and nurses in the VA out of the hands of the Civil Service Commission to hire these staff more quickly and with improved salary levels based on quality of credentials and experience. This part of the legislation would be opposed by the powerful Civil Service Commission. However, as noted previously, I've not changed slides. As noted previously, Hawley had 16,000 physicians under his command in Europe who knew the medical care needs of veterans. Hawley knew they respected him and would want to work for him again if he could compete with the lure of starting a private practice after the war. Bradley and Hawley wanted to avoid a cumbersome and lengthy recruitment process used in federal government for hiring personnel in order to do that, and use what was called Title 38 Recruitment and Personnel Authority. Slide 13. Secondly, Bradley and Hawley, as already mentioned, wanted authority for the VA to establish affiliation agreements with medical schools to train their medical students in the VA and have their training supervised by experienced faculty. Now, Bradley and Hawley were convinced that bringing medical school faculty and students into the VA would bring the VA into the mainstream of patient care and lead to improved health care for veterans. And again, affiliation agreements had been previously established between the Army and medical schools, and Hawley believed these affiliations had helped the training of Army doctors, and firmly believed these affiliation agreements would also help the VA. And previous attempts to establish affiliation agreements in the VA were turned down a number of times by Congress, however, as opponents kept implying that our veterans would be subject to experimentation by student doctors. Bradley and Hawley knew that would be a hard sell to Congress. Lastly, Bradley and Hawley wanted to create professional division offices in VA central office in such areas as medicine, surgery, neuropsychiatry, and rehabilitation, with the division leaders reporting to a chief medical director who would in turn report to Bradley. Those division heads would then be responsible for developing treatment programs in VA hospitals and have oversight for their discipline's activities in their hospital. Now you may ask, well, why was it necessary to get legislation for this? Well, even today, Congress kind of holds a firm view that anything changing in the organization ought to be at least approved, if not passed by them for acknowledgement. And at the time, the only legislation, the only organizational action that was available to Bradley without legislation was to move the VA's lone one medical officer out of the Office of Construction Supply and Real Estate, where he consulted on the design of VA hospitals. Bradley, however, wanted that one person to advise him and report directly to him. And Bradley made that move when he brought Hawley on board in what would become the VA's first medical director. Okay, to make the long story a little bit shorter, um, the legislation that Bradley and Hawley wanted was passed by Congress and signed into law on January 3rd, 1946. Not without some turmoil, but that's another story. Without further comment, though, what I wanted to note is that the day after the legislation was signed, that Northwestern University and the University of Illinois placed 56 medical residents for training at the VA hospital in Hines outside of Chicago. Magnuson had done his job in getting support from medical schools for the VA's affiliation plan. I can also note that by the end of 1946, 63 of the nation's medical schools had affiliation agreements with the VA. Well, what about the new neuropsychiatry division in central office, which was called at the time? The neuropsychiatry division had three sections: psychiatry, neurology, and psychology. James Greer Miller was selected to head the psychology section and provide oversight for psychological services in VA hospitals. And he was given authority and funding to hire 500 psychologists for VA hospitals. Now, Miller's first decision, probably the most far-reaching decision he ever made, was that the VA would recruit psychologists for veterans patient care only if they had a doctoral degree and had some clinical service or training experience. Now, this was an unheard of credentialing requirement for employment of psychologists at the time. In fact, it can be noted that the 1946 VA decision to hire doctoral staff psychologists who had both academic and clinical training predated the decision made at the 1949 Boulder Conference that established the science practitioner model as the norm for training in clinical psychology. The decision to hire only doctoral psychologists with clinical service training also presented Miller with his first problem. There were only about 750 doctoral psychologists with clinical experience and working as clinicians in the entire country. The VA psychologist with a doctoral degree and clinical experience he was authorized to hire represented approximately 2/3 of all current doctor psychologists working in clinical settings in the entire country. Miller knew, and he realized this beforehand, that he would have to train the psychologists he wanted to work in the VA. And again, that need for clinically trained doctoral psychologists that Miller insisted on for the treatment of veterans was to be met by the VA psychology training program. Another overlap in the beginning of VA psychology and the beginning of the VA psychology training program. Miller's strategy, is that he noted the legislation to affiliate and train students in the VA specifically mentioned only medical, dental, and nursing students. Miller found out, however, that there was language in the legislation that would permit part-time employment of psychology graduate students with a training assignment to deliver the psychological services to patients and be supervised by their university faculty. He convinced Bradley of this interpretation and was permitted to use some of the money he had to recruit and hire psychologists to pay psychology students and provide consulting fees to university faculty to supervise training. Next up, problem. Uh, Most psychology graduate students in the country were not providing any clinical service training for their students. In the 1940s, you have to remember, APA in most universities considered clinical psychology an academic profession whose only legitimate professional activities were to teach and do research. The VA asked APA to identify which universities were giving clinical service training to their students. Eventually, APA identified 22 such universities, and the VA planned to recruit and pay students for training only from those 22 schools. Now, past and current interns and postdocs receiving their training in the VA will be interested in knowing that in 1946, universities and medical schools were beginning to think of providing practicum and internship training for psychology graduates, but were not planning to pay them any training stipend. They argued that the training would be best introduced as a high-grade learning experience and that providing a stipend might be considered a low-grade job and underrate the training aspect. The VA, however, was planning to pay a stipend to graduate students. Miller knew that many students would be married veterans, some with children, using the VGI Bill to fund their graduate training. He wanted psychology students, first of all, to have parity with medical students who would be paid a stipend while in training, and he wanted a stipend for students to free them from economic concerns in supporting their families so that they can better attend to their training. When the U.S. Public Health Service, which later became the National Institute, um, uh, uh, when the Health Service also announced that they would be paying stipends to graduate students in their new grant program. The universities and medical schools had no choice but to find money to pay a stipend to their schools while doing practicum and internship training in order to remain competitive with the VA and the Public Health Service. It can be noted that historians generally credit the VA's request of APA to identify those schools with clinical service training to have led to the eventual decision of APA to begin their accreditation program for graduate schools of psychology. Well, let's take a look at that first VA psychology training class. In the fall of 1946, 215 graduate students from 22 universities began their training in clinical work with veterans in the VA. The significance of the beginning of the VA psychology training program was not overlooked by APA, who published the names of all 215 students in the universities in a 1947 issue of the American Psychologist. Um, Now, as Miller was putting together the VA psychology training program, he also convinced VA management to require all VA hospitals, to have a psychology service. Now, one of the first doctoral psychologists hired to start a psychology service in the VA was Roy Brenner, who was recruited by the VA hospital in Hines in 1946. They had just started training medical residents, remember. Dr. Brenner had a number of stories about those early days, as reported to me by his wife, Golda. One of those stories, and one of his favorite stories apparently, was that nobody knew how to spell psychology, and they certainly didn't know what a psychologist was supposed to do. He also told the story that although he was chief, he had no staff. Let me tell you one other favorite story. Dr. Brenner would tell that when he was hired at Heinz, there was only one office left for management to assign, and they were trying to decide whether to give it to Dr. Brenner or the barber. Dr. Brenner ended his story by reporting that the barber got it. But Dr. Brenner soon got the next office available and went on to develop one of the premier psychology services and psychology training programs in the early VA. Charles Stinger, who's another early chief, tells a story of when he was hired as the chief of psychology at the Coral Gables VA, that's now Miami, with no staff, that nobody knew what psychologists were supposed to do. When Stinger tells the story, however, with a twinkle in his eyes, he will add what a wonderful opportunity it was to be given the chance to develop a psychology service the way he wanted it to function. Going back to the training program, in the fall, when 46, when the training program began for the first class, there were only 50, maybe 60 doctoral psychologists in the entire VA. The 215 psychology residents, however, trainees, as they were called, however, were assigned throughout the VA to hospitals closest to their universities. Some went to VAs with a doctoral psychology presence, some went to VAs with only a master's level psychology presence, and some went to VAs with no psychology presence other than weekly visits by supervising university faculty. I might add here that for some of those students, the VA closest to their university may have been 80 miles away. In 1946, 1/4 of all VA hospitals were designated as neuropsychiatric hospitals, with some hospitals having as many as 3,000 long-term psych patients. And most of those hospitals had no doctoral psychology staff presence. Remember, since Thorazine wasn't introduced into hospitals until 1958, the pre-Thorazine and pre-antipsychotic medication era of management of psychotic and aggressive patients in both the VA and non-VA hospitals included straitjackets, cold packs, and electroshock treatment. Trainees often reported that they sharpened their assessment skills with assessments based only on observation and interactions with patients. Lee Gorell was an early VA trainee I interviewed who was assigned to one of the large neuropsychiatric hospitals with no psychology presence. He reported that trainees did what they could to help patients and essentially supervised each other by sharing and discussing their patient care experiences with one another. Now, Gorell indicated that university faculty did in fact come to the college, to the hospital for weekly supervision and seminars, but many of their faculty had never seen a schizophrenic patient, and most had no experience whatsoever working with active and aggressive psychotic patients. Gorell later wrote and presented in a seminar or a presentation at APA in describing those early years that the university supervisors, in fact, learned with their students and took that learning back to their classroom. He described one university psychology graduate school director who thanked the VA for providing training experience for both their students and supervising faculty for what they learned that they brought back and improved the quality of their graduate program. In spite of those difficulties facing some psychology trainees, they almost universally report in oral interviews that their training was positive and they experienced valuable learning. They were young, enthusiastic, and saw the relevance and need for their training. They believed that they were helping patients. Almost all early VA trainees were veterans and appreciated the fact that they were not only learning valuable skills, but were additionally motivated by having the opportunity to help their fellow veterans. And the trainees further report that their enthusiasm and desire to help patients kind of inspired and was respected by other VA staff and helped develop important working relationships with nurses and others. In interviews with another one of those early psychology trainees, um, it was reported that trainees and nurses would often share classes and information with each other. The nursing aides, who were the lowest trained and poorest paid nursing staff on the psych units, could be especially helpful, they reported, if you respected their knowledge of the patient and if they trusted you. If an aide approached a trainee in those days and said, he heard the trainee was planning to see Mr. Jones today, and that today might not be a good day to talk to Mr. Jones. Heeding that advice would likely save the trainee a lot of grief. So, taking a look at those first 10 years, uh, the first years of VA psychology set the stage, of course, for much of those future years. Um, and the early history of the psychology training program are virtually the same. It can also be noted that in the first 10 years of the training program, 85% of trainees became VA psychology staff after receiving their doctoral degree. Miller had, in fact, found a clinically trained psychologist he wanted in the VA using the psychology training program. Looking ahead to the 50s and 60s, by 1960, psychology trainees still outnumbered doctoral staff, 775 to 750, but trainees were assigned to training only to VA hospitals with a doctoral psychology presence. By 1960, VA psychologists had earned respect for their leadership in treatment programming, including their work in the new outpatient mental health clinics and their pioneering work in establishing group therapy as a viable and important treatment approach in both inpatient and outpatient care programs. In 1960, in fact, the VA published the first ever treatment manual for group therapy that focused on practical advice on running therapy groups that augmented what was mostly theoretical aspects of group therapy developed in academia. Topics in the manual included a chapter on which patients seem to receive the most benefit, another chapter, how to prepare patients for group therapy. And there were additional chapters, one on how to handle hostile patients, another on how to handle despondent patients, another on silent patients, and lastly on talkative patients. Unfortunately for the VA and fortunately for future patients, the VA group therapy training manual uh, frequently left with the trainee to follow itself into many non-VA psychiatric treating settings, necessitating follow-up printing of that for distribution within the VA. Now, while VA and non-VA psychiatrists remained focused on the use of psychoanalytic treatments in the 60s, psychology found the approach to have limited usefulness by the VA's acutely disturbed patient population. And, as was being done by their non-VA colleagues, psychologists started introducing behavioral health treatment programs in the VA. These and other non-traditional programs were highlighted at a national VA conference in Chicago in 1965. Some of the topics presented by psychologists at the time were token economy treatment programs for schizophrenia in Palo Alto and substance abuse, attitude therapy for inpatient treatment programs, day hospital and day treatment center outpatient programs, therapeutic milieu programs for inpatient psych and other intensive outpatient mental health programs, and behavioral interventions with med-surg patients relaxation therapy, treating depression in post-surgical patients, etc. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this presentation is not intended to focus on the research activities of psychologists and their trainees. The topics at the Chicago conference had research findings and evaluation strategies included in the presentations. Over the first 20 years of VA psychology and its training program, hundreds of trainees completed doctoral dissertations based on their involvement in these programs. You can also note that because the VA had psychiatric, medical, and surgical treatment coexisting often in the same hospital, psychologists and trainees frequently transported what they were learning from behavioral treatment of psychiatric patients to treatment of and research with the med-surg patient. Kind of an early health psychology approach, if you will. A small sample of such programs includes research and treatment of tuberculosis, biofeedback treatment for convulsions, treatment of psychological complications and renal dialysis, spinal cord injury care, and traumatic brain care. I'm going to try to summarize this so we have some time for some questions. I started this off this last slide by saying no one can predict what the future will bring, but if past history is an indicator, future VA psychology historians will continue to tell the story of the combined importance and contributions of VA psychologists in the lives of veterans and the training of psychologists. And since the 2007 book cited earlier on the history of VA continues for another 40 years, it's very easy to make that prediction because that's in fact what happened. The next 40 years show that VA psychologists continue to demonstrate program leadership and new applications of psychological skills in helping veterans, and have continued its leadership and growth in the training, funding, and accreditation of psychology interns and postdoctoral residents over those 40 years. I see no reason why that will not continue. And it's essentially those of you listening to this presentation today that are combining and working and learning and training. They're the ones that are going to be continuing this rich tradition of VA psychology. And I add my appreciation and thanks to all VA psychology staff and interns and postdocs for their work and support of the patient care of our veterans. At that, I want to thank you, and I will just leave this slide while we're talking about answering any questions that might come up. This is kind of a bibliography. The 2007 book is the first listing, and you can see some others. Alrighty. I see Mark is typing something. Glad to have you on board, Mark. What's your question?
And if others have questions, feel free to type those in the chat box too. Oh, okay, here's something from Mark. Do you here?
What's the first
I'll
part
read
of
it out
It starts
loud.
with challenges.
Oh.
Always.
Okay.
No, I just slide it up. Okay, we got that slide corrected. Mark, in addition to being intellectually interesting, history provides insights on how to deal with current changes, and especially in rural areas. Thoughts? Excellent question, Mark. I will first parenthetically add one of my delights in studying history and comparing it with what things are going on today is I'm rarely challenged in finding some period in the past that doesn't reflect exactly what we're experiencing today. There have been attempts on the part of many people for the last 20 years to privatize the VA. The voucher system. Give veterans this voucher that says that they are veteran authorized for care, whatever. A couple of things happen. Veterans don't like it because they go to, this is in the past. In the past, veterans don't like it because they go to these guys who don't even know how to do a military history, who are ill prepared for it, and they just started coming back to the VA and found a way to get treated. So privatization is not new. We've been with it for a while. Now they got some stronger proponents. Uh, the VA did not do itself any favor in setting itself up for some of the very bad press that we got several years ago, and we're kind of dealing with a bunch of that. The other thing is that we've been doing. Um, we don't call it privatization. It's the contract. We have both a VA hospital contract program and another program for those veterans who, in fact, cannot travel the distances that are needed in some places, like Texas, Montana, whatever. We've been doing that for years. What's kind of different from what is proposed now is that the VA was the one who kind of authorized it, and they would kind of be in charge of finding out what was happening to the patient after they referred to someone in the community, you know, that they weren't supervising. Um, and they had authority to bring the patient back into the VA if the patient started complaining, um, or if they found out what was happening. And so it's not a new phenomenon. I heard about privatization when I started in the VA back in the 60s. Uh, and let me see, about every 10 years. The 70s had a period, the 80s had a period. Um, so nothing new under the sun. Other question.
Looks like Brad is typing in a question. Dr. Baker, I was thinking about the story about the barber versus the psychologist in that office, and I know there was a different point to that story, but I was just thinking, man, space was still limited way back then. Okay, here's Brad's question. When did formal psychological
My other
Brad's
thought.
question is when did formal okay. Okay.
Yes, I'll answer. Why don't you start? Okay. But let me comment on what
Oh,
just
sure.
you were just talking about, Tiffany. The other story I pointed out about the barber versus psychologist's office is that a few years ago when we had this massive expansion of psychology, and psychology chiefs were pulling out their
Hmm.
hair because they couldn't find office space, right? Well, Miller had position and authority to hire 500 psychologists. Where was he going to find those offices? Anyway, um, the formal psychological and I'll separate psychological from neuropsychological assessment, Brad. Psychological assessments they were started in 1946. There were some graduate students who came to the VA that actually had a Rorschach course, a TAT, and whatever. And again, as I said, but most graduate students had absolutely no exposure to any kind of psychological testing, whatever, and had never seen a patient before coming to the VA. Now, neuropsychological testing uh, is in is in a little bit different category because there were some times in the early that made toward the end of the 40s when neuropsychological assessment and interest in that kind of assessment started spurting up all over. So, in fact, some of you have heard of or perhaps know Jerry Goldstein, who was working at the Topeka VA and developed a neuropsychological lab in 1947 or 8, somewhere along there. Uh, at the same time, these neuropsychological places were coming up. In the Boston area, you had that whole area that was starting at that time. So these are kind of sprouting up almost all at the same time. So we VA psychological testing. I mean, that was a very important kind of activity site for psychologists. Um, in fact, Miller, when he thought about psychologists, basically said, he says, what we're going to do is psychological testing, research, and we're going to do some therapy. And he didn't add, but psychiatry did, under the supervision of psychiatrists, which they didn't know anything more about it. So psychology ended up supervising their own people, and having the psychologists supervising it from universities made a heck of a lot of sense. Mahalo
Yeah,
too. Okay.
Dr. McNamara is still having trouble with the microphone, so I just
No.
copied a message that she typed up for everybody and put it into the chat box. Um,
Oh yeah. Well, in retirement, you can afford to spend whatever time you want doing anything you want. I still love mentoring, so I mentor students. Right now, I'm mentoring within the AVAPL mentoring program, but actually had a crack at starting a couple of those in the past. You
yeah,
know, we're getting pretty close to that 1 o'clock hour. What do you
I
think?
think
Got
that
time
may
for
be
any more
all the
questions?
questions that have come through, and I'll just go ahead and wrap up our webinar today. Um, So thanks everybody for joining us today. Thanks again to Dr. Baker for your lovely presentation. Also, thanks for the information shared by Dr. McNamara in the chat box regarding the historian team and our archives. Um, and so for those interested in receiving one continuing education credit for participating in this webinar, you're able to do this by completing the online evaluation, the SurveyMonkey link that's in the note box, but it's also, I just copied into the chat box. You can complete the online evaluation. For those of you who are members of Division 18, continuing education credit is free. For non-members, you are able to request CE if you're interested for a fee of $15, and you can pay that through our PayPal link, also found in a notes pod. And then I'll email CE certificates in about 2 to 3 weeks. I'll also send a follow-up email to everybody who registered today, so that way you can get these instructions. And also before we go, I want to give a quick plug for next month's webinar on April 4th on the roles of psychologists in whole health, presented by Dr. Kathy Hedrick from the Office of Patient-Centered Care and Cultural Transformation. And so I'll be sending out an advertisement for this webinar soon, so please stay tuned. And for any other follow-up questions, just feel free to contact me. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks again, Dr. Baker.
You're quite welcome.